Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to thank you for joining us for our webinar today. It is the first in a series of 4 webinars that we're going to offer over the next 3 weeks relating to issues that arise in the context of bid protest. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, June 10th. It'll run from 2:30 to 4, and it'll discuss winning strategies and themes in the context of bid protest. On Thursday, June 17th, between 12 and 1:30, we'll be having another webinar on key personnel, which is an issue that we're frequently seeing in the context of a bid protest. And then on June 24th, between 12 and 1:30, we'll be closing out our series on bid protest with a discussion of organizational conflicts of interest. For today's webinar, our topic is effective proposal writing and debriefing strategies. My name is Paul DeBolt, and I'm the chair of Venable's Government Contracts Group. Joining me on today's panel are my colleagues, James Boland and Lindsay Reed. And we're looking forward to discussing some of the issues that we see in the context of bid protest that may enable you to put your company in a better position to compete for a contract. Lindsay, could we go to the next page, please? So we have 3 parts that we're going to cover today. I'm going to discuss effective proposal writing. Lindsay will discuss key themes in case law, and then James will discuss effective debriefing strategies. There may be some questions that you have relating to bid protest topics that may be outside the scope of the presentation today. I think most of the issues that we're going to cover over the next 3 weeks should address different questions that folks may have, but you can submit questions to the panel and we'll try to work through those as quickly as we can. So Lindsay, if we could go to the next slide, we're going to talk about effective proposal writing. If we go to the 4th slide, I think one of the issues that we see is sort of a misunderstanding by some contractors, or even fairly sophisticated contractors, between the purpose of Section L and Section M. In the context of a FAR Part 15 procurement, Section L contains the information and instructions to assist offerors in preparing their proposals, including how it should be organized, how it should be submitted, the various factors and how those should be addressed in the context of the proposal. And then Section M actually sets forth the evaluation criteria that the government is going to use. It's going to contain all the significant factors, any significant sub-factors, as well as their relative importance to the government in the context of the evaluation. So you may have a situation where technical is more important than management, or management is more important than past performance, or technical management, past performance are more important than price. It's important to appreciate how the factors are weighted by the government, because that's going to give you some guidance on what areas you need to focus on. Because you could get a great score in sub-factor 5, but if it's a relatively insignificant sub-factor and one of your competitors has higher ratings in the factors that the government is given more weight to, it could be very difficult to win a contract or to successfully prosecute a protest. The other thing that I think people forget is that, and you'll see this a lot in the context of protest, is that although Section M sets forth the stated evaluation criteria, it also includes evaluation criteria that are fairly encompassed within a particular criteria. A lot of times you'll see this in the context of discussions with clients where they believe that the government has applied an unstated evaluation criteria because the criteria that they were measured against wasn't specifically articulated in Section M. But sometimes, the risk that you run is that the GAO is going to find that the stated criteria also encompassed the criteria that the government applied to your proposal. Sometimes when you look at a solicitation, it seems that they're clear from their terms, but frequently there's a disconnect between how the government interprets the solicitations requirements and how a contractor may read them. This can frequently arise in the context of where an offeror is an incumbent. And what happens in that context is that instead of writing to the current PWS and the current evaluation criteria, the incumbent will write to what they're seeing on the ground, or they'll write to discussions they've had with their customers about what the customer wants. And, I've seen any number of situations where a client has asked us to file a protest because they're receiving feedback from the program office that the other solution isn't really what they want. Well, that's all well and good, but if what the program office really wants isn't reflected in the actual PWS and the actual evaluation criteria, their wants and desires really aren't going to carry any weight. Offers. Go ahead, James. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me just jump in there, and that's a really good point. And I think that it's important for folks to recognize that in many, if not most, acquisitions, the program team is different than the team that's conducting the competition, the contracts office. And so, usually the point of contact, if you're sort of the lead project manager on a contract, especially if you're an incumbent, you've got a relationship with the government. You may be led to believe certain things based on that relationship, and you may even be receiving feedback, which sounds great and it affects your proposal. But you can't assume that those people are in touch with the contract team, the source selection team who's writing the RFP and evaluating these proposals. Now, oftentimes they are the same, but sometimes they're different, and so I think that's just a really important point to emphasize that you need to you need to follow what's in the written RFP, because ultimately that's what's going to control.
And James makes a good point that to the extent the program office is going to be involved, their ability typically to shape the procurement is in the development of the PWS or assisting with the development of the evaluation criteria. And if their wants, their desires, what they're communicating to your company isn't reflected in those documents, it can present a problem if you write to the conversations rather than write to what's in the RFP or the RFQ. I think another situation we see, and James has handled hundreds of protests as well, is that a lot of times incumbents assume that they're going to get evaluated based on the information that the customer currently has about the incumbent contractor. And that's just not going to happen. I mean, what's going to happen is the government's going to focus on the four corners of your proposal. So if you have things that you want to articulate, you need to include it in the four corners of your proposal. So if we could go to the next slide, Lindsay. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about are some proposal writing essentials. And I know that a lot of these are probably self-evident to many of you that have been, in the industry for even a short period of time. But, in preparing the webinar, in discussions with James and Lindsay, we thought it was important to reemphasize some of these fundamental principles because, we see these mistakes being made over and over and over again. And it's not just relatively new entrants to the federal marketplace. You'll see mistakes being made by companies that are worth billions of dollars and have been selling goods and services to governments for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So we thought it would be important to just sort of underscore some of these issues. You have to comply with the instructions. Those, as we mentioned, those are going to be set forth in Section L. But time and time again, you'll see situations where offerers don't. They won't pay attention to when the proposal has to be submitted or how it has to be submitted or when or what time zone applies to the submission time. You see offerors that use the wrong font size. You see offerors that use the right font size for a drawing and then a different font size for something else. And these are all things that could result in your proposal not being evaluated, because when they make the adjustment to the appropriate font size, you may exceed a page limitation, and the government doesn't have an obligation to evaluate information that's contained in pages beyond the page limit. You'll see a failure to include resumes. You'll see a failure to include resumes that adequately demonstrate the requirements for a particular job on the project. You'll see failures to include letters of commitment, failures to include signed letters of commitment, typographical errors, poor grammar. We've had clients that the proposal was to be submitted on a CD, and the CD was empty, so there was no proposal to evaluate. And making the argument that it must have been erased by the government scanning procedure or something else just didn't carry any weight. So you really do need to look through things and make sure things are correct. When I talk about the four corners of the proposal, what I'm talking about is the actual words on the page. So typically you're going to have a technical volume. The words that are in the technical volume is what's going to be evaluated. The management volume, the words that are in the management volume are what's going to be evaluated. The information in your cost proposal that you submit, that's what's going to be evaluated. Now, when they're evaluating your proposal, they're going to look at what you're saying, but the government, in the context of a cost proposal, especially with labor categories, they can look at outside sources to verify whether what's in your proposal is correct or not, or what's in your proposal is reasonable. A lot of time they'll use the Bureau of Labor Standards or other types of information to see if they think labor standards are correct. They can also, and they typically say this in the Section M with regard to past performance, that they're allowed to consider other sources than what's in your proposal. So they can do that, but just as a general rule, they're going to look at what you've written, especially with your technical, your management approach, to ensure, and that's what's going to be evaluated. It's important to know the evaluation scheme. If you have 5 factors and factor 1 is more important than factors 2 to 5 combined, focus your time and energy on factor 1. If the RFP says that price is the least important factor, you need to believe that. If we go to the next slide, Lindsay, please. The other thing
on that,
go ahead,
Paul, before you go on to that next point, I think on that last one, I just want to make an observation that a common theme that I've seen is when offerors will make an assumption that maybe the government will value some sort of savings, almost like they're sort of thinking of the proposal as a sort of commercial transaction where you may offer some discount and you try to sort of hype up the value added services that are embedded in your price and rely on that to give you a competitive edge. And sometimes that falls flat if the weighting scheme says that price is not that important or the least important factor. In those situations, you got to believe it and recognize that what really will matter to the government, at least according to the RFP, is the technical or management approach where you exceed requirements, and they're willing to pay a premium for that. So you have to structure the capture strategy around what the RFP is saying the government is going to care most about.
That's a good point. But we've touched on this a little bit previously, is that you really do need to write to the evaluation criteria and address every factor. Again, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, A lot of people write, a lot of offerors write to the agency's future needs, or it's understanding what the program office really wants, or what it's actually encountering on a day-to-day basis if it's the incumbent. And a lot of times you see this in the context of like technology insertions or software upgrades or staffing. But again, I can't emphasize enough that you really do need to write your proposal to address the evaluation criteria. But it's important to note that in the context of a bid protest, that the GAO is only going to review the agency's stated evaluation criteria, and it's going to review your proposal against the stated evaluation criteria as well as applicable law and regulation. They're not going to come back in and reevaluate your proposal. The GAO is also not going to give you the opportunity to amplify things in your proposal or clarify your proposal or fill in the gaps of your proposal in the context of a bid protest. And we'll touch on this when Lindsay talks, but, one of the first lines of defense the GAO takes is that it's an offeror's obligation to submit a well-written proposal. And that gives an easy out to them if your proposal is not well-written and clear and understandable and articulates in an understandable manner, what you're going to accomplish for the government. And to the extent that questions do arise in the context of a procurement, you really do need to ask questions. To the extent that you can get involved early in defining the definition of the requirements, the white papers or things, that's not a bad approach. You certainly should avail yourself of the opportunity to submit questions prior to the time and date that proposals are due. Attend industry day sessions and ask questions, and clarify understandings in your proposal. There's some clauses that are out there now, like with regard to the Maduro regime, that have been included in any number of contracts as a DFARS provision. And the clause isn't exactly clear on how far its reach or scope is. So, if it's not clear, you need to articulate in your proposal back to the government what your understanding is of it and what you meant by it when you responded to that clause. Now, it's outside the scope of our discussion today. We'll be talking about this next Thursday. But, one of the things you can also consider is a pre-award protest if you're trying to get some clarification and the government doesn't adequately respond to your questions or doesn't respond in a meaningful way or really doesn't clarify the issue. Those, I'm not going to say they're highly successful, but no bid protest is. One of the strategies that we can talk about next week is, in the context of a procurement, it doesn't make sense to use the agency level protest as a way to help shape or clarify something rather than going to the GAO. So if we could go to the next slide, Lindsay, please. So we're continuing to talk a little bit about effective writing strategies. I know it's going to sound trite, but words matter. You need to tell the agency what you're going to do to fulfill the contract's requirements. Obviously, commitments are stronger than aspirational goals. You want to structure your proposal in a way that you're going to get credit for exceeding requirements, providing the government more than what they've asked for. But sometimes offerors get so focused on showing the enhancements or additive features that they're going to provide that they don't really address the RFP requirements. And so, I think it's a better approach to ensure that you address the RFP requirements first, and then focus on areas where you can propose features or enhancements that are going to exceed those fundamental requirements. But I think it's critical to make sure you cover the basics first. When you're writing the proposal, you want to make the evaluator's job easy. If there's things that are supposed to be in a specific section of a proposal, like management versus technical, make sure you're there. There's no guarantee that something that was supposed to, and frequently it doesn't happen, based on how these teams are structured, that if you have something in the management proposal that was supposed to be in the technical, you're not going to get credit for it. So you need to make sure that you're putting the information in the appropriate section of the proposal. You also need to ensure that the proposal is consistent. A lot of times we'll see inconsistencies in an offer's proposal where, they say X in one part of their proposal and Y there, and the government's going to make the determination that it's really unclear what you're proposing or unclear what your solution is because of that inconsistency. And it could result in a weakness, or it could result in you not receiving strength for something that would otherwise be deemed a strength. So it's very important that your proposal is consistent. The other area we see a lot of issues are sometimes one of the other issues we see are, the roles and responsibility of teaming partners, JV partners, subcontractors aren't clearly defined. I mean, if you're going to use a subsidiary, corporate subsidiary or a teaming partner or a subcontractor's corporate experience or past performance references, you need to show that they're going to actually have that role on the contract. You can find any number of cases from the GAO where, a large corporation, they have any number of wholly owned subsidiaries that do work. They try to take credit for the work of a wholly owned subsidiary that's not actually going to perform any work on the subcontract. And, you're not going to get credit for that. So it's important to show, what roles the team members, subcontractors are going to have. To the extent you're using their references for corporate experience, for past performance, you need to show that that work they did on that contract has some relationship to what they're going to be what they're going to do on this contract. Go to the next slide, Lindsay. We mentioned earlier that you need to address, every requirement. But addressing a requirement doesn't mean simply parroting it back. You simply can't say, we hear and obey. You actually need to describe what you're going to do to address that requirement. If the requirement is provide 24/7 help desk support, you simply can't say we will provide 24/7 help desk support. Okay, you need to say how you're going to do it. Is it going to be across time zones? What other support mechanisms are you going to have? You need to articulate a strategy for that. The second bullet, you need to demonstrate an understanding of your requirements or the validity of your approach with references to past examples, incumbent work. One of these areas is with regard to incumbent capture. If historically on, procurements, you've had a 95% incumbent capture rate, you need to say it so that you get credit for it. It sounds much better to say what you've done historically and what you've been able to do and how you've done that than just saying it's an aspiration that we're going to capture 95% incumbent capture. And we talked a little bit about. Oh, go ahead, James. I'm sorry.
Well, one of the questions that we received from a listener was actually on this point here about how can you demonstrate understanding of requirements when that's one of the evaluation criteria? And I think this example is one way, and I'll sort of ask that question to you as well. But I think in this instance, one way to do that is not only to describe an approach that's consistent with what the RFP is asking you to do, but to provide some real life examples that show that the approach is valid and that you've actually executed something like that what they're asking for. But Paul, what are your thoughts on ways that someone can demonstrate an understanding of a requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the help desk is a decent example of that. That if you've been providing help desk support on any number of contracts, I think it's fair to say that we have provided help desk support on 32 contracts across various time zones. we intend to implement the processes that we've perfected under this. This will include, and then tell them what you're going to do to meet that standard. So I think you kind of set the table that you have the experience, and then describe how those procedures or processes are going to work in the context of this procurement. Um, I think a lot of people talk about reach back. One of the concerns the government has is, what's the turnover going to be, and how are you going to be able to backfill people that leave on a particular contract? If, you could talk about your retention rate being 95%. We have facilitated this retention rate through a fulsome benefits program. We provide tuition, we provide 401k, we do whatever. But, if the requirement is have a high rate of retention, tell them what you've done historically, tell them what strategies you've used previously that worked, and how you're going to apply them in the context of this specific procurement. Do you have any additional thoughts, James?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's a little bit of an ambiguous requirement. It's one of those evaluation criteria that allows the government a lot of room to critique a proposal when a proposal says something that is inconsistent with what the government wants. And so I think maybe just one of the thought is that you can also demonstrate an understanding of requirements by not saying something that's inconsistent with what they want. Sort of making sure
Right.
that it's in line, because it can be used. It can be used. It gives the government an easy way to assign a weakness to your approach.
Yeah, and look, it's tough to overturn weaknesses. The GAO gives so much deference to the agency's judgment. It's tough to say that how an agency evaluator read your proposal is wrong. It almost has to be unreasonable or inconsistent. But, as we both know, and as Lindsay knows, mere disagreement with the agency's evaluation isn't going to carry any weight at the GAO. I think that, another area where we see issues are resumes of key personnel. A lot of times they don't demonstrate the minimum experience. They don't show the required certification or the accepted alternative to a specific certification. One of the mistakes you see sometime is that you have an individual's resume and they may have a period where they're performing 2 functions at a company or consecutive functions at a company, and the offeror will try to tally those up as separate years. But basically, if it's the guy doing 2 jobs in the same calendar year, you're getting credit for 1 year. You're not getting credit for 2 years. So he may be a great employee and he can wear multiple hats, or she can wear multiple hats, but you're not going to get credit for it. So if it says 7 years experience, you need to go through, look at the months of when they were employed and ensure that it adds up to 7 years. And, some companies, they just miss that. The other area that arises in the context of key personnel is that, when it's a material requirement, is that companies fail to let the government know that a key employee is left. And that can be problematic. Over the last couple of years, we've been seeing more and more of people raising protest grounds relating to key personnel. I call it the LinkedIn protest ground, because typically what's going to happen is that, if a protester and their outside counsel, they get access to your proposal and you have key personnel listed, the first thing the outside counsel is going to go to LinkedIn and see if that person's still employed with your company or whether they've left. And if they've left, they're going to say that a key personnel left the program and is no longer available. They're not going to be able to perform. The awardee should have told you this. They didn't. They should be disqualified. The other thing that people will scour to try to identify whether you have all your key personnel still on the project or not is your job listings. I had a protest a couple years ago where there were key personnel required for a contract. The company had kept up the job opportunities on their website for the key personnel. And so the protester naturally assumed that, these jobs hadn't been filled, or why would you still have the requisitions up online? And it turned out that, the company had a policy of keeping its requisitions up online for 3, 4, 5, 6 months into a contract on the off chance that somebody left, but it didn't mean that the job was still open. And, the director of human resources provided a declaration that GAO explained to them their process, and, that issue was gone. The last topic I wanted to talk about in the context of employee categories is FAR Part A procurements. It's very, very important that you ensure that your federal supply service category to which you're going to map a position in response to a specific RFQ makes reference to the knowledge or experience for the position in the RFQ you're going to map to. So if your federal supply service category doesn't cover analysis of a particular agency's regulations, but you're mapping it to a job category that says you do have to have that particular skill, there's a risk that that individual is not going to be found qualified. So, the personnel issues can be important. Lindsay, can we go to the next slide, please? This is kind of basic, but it's important that it's important during discussions to answer the question asked and recognize when the government has a concern. It's not sufficient to go back to the government and say you shouldn't worry about this. If the government wasn't worried about it, they wouldn't have provided you the question in the first place. Now, just because you get a request for clarification or a question doesn't mean that you have to rewrite your proposal. You really need to focus on the issue that the government has articulated and respond to that. The last 2 points on this page we've already touched on, that you shouldn't make assumptions. The agency is going to know what you're talking about. Again, if it's not in your proposal, not getting evaluated. And then the last point we touched on, briefly, was that explain why corporate experience, past performance references are relevant to this specific procurement. A lot of times you'll see this, as I mentioned, in the context of affiliates and subsidiaries. To the extent you're going to use those references, those entities need to have a role in corporate performance. I have seen a couple cases over the last 2 years that could be concerning. You have certain companies that they're large government contractors. They have a headquarters someplace, in the country. It could be Texas, could be California, wherever. And associated with that corporate headquarters is a cage code or DUNS number. And then in their proposal, they will have offices, no, not affiliates or wholly owned subsidiaries, just an office in another state who they want to use their past performance reference. And I've seen situations where that reference wasn't credited because the offeror did not clearly articulate how that office was going to have some role in the overall performance of the contract. I don't know that I agree with that outcome. I think it's kind of sort of an overly narrow view of how companies are structured. I sort of get it in the context of an affiliate or a wholly owned subsidiary, but to have to articulate how a specific office, in Melbourne, Florida, whose past performance reference you're going to use is going to work on this contract when it's all part of the same company. I don't know. I think that's that one troubled me a little bit. So the key takeaways from my section before I turn it over to Lindsay, it's important to follow the instructions in section L. I can't emphasize this enough. Write to the evaluation criteria, not what the program office has told you, not to what your experience is on the ground. and neatness counts. You need to avoid typos, follow instructions, have sentences that make sense, because that's all going to get factored into how the government views your proposal. So the next area Lindsay's going to cover for us is to talk about key themes in case law. And I think it's important, or we thought it was important, the group of us thought it was important to discuss these issues so that, in the context of putting your proposal together and contemplating a protest, it's important to know what standard the GAO is going to apply to any specific ground. So Lindsay, why don't you go ahead and walk us through the next few slides.
Sure, thank you, Paul. So our first point, our first key theme is something that Paul did touch on already, which is the idea that the offeror has the burden of submitting the well-written proposal. And this case is a great example. In this case, the protester failed to include some cost information in its cost proposal such that the Army wasn't able to do a cost realism analysis. And the protester argued that the Army could have reverse engineered the missing information. It would only take a few simple calculations to do so, but the GAO denied the protest and reminded us that an offeror is responsible for submitting the well-written proposal. Another key theme is—
Lindsay, could before you jump on to the next slide, I do think it's important, and I'm sure James has views on this too, that in the context of how your cost or price is going to be evaluated, you really do need to appreciate the difference between a price realism analysis, a cost realism analysis, and a price reasonableness analysis, right? A price reasonableness is going to focus on whether your price is too high, and typically that's done through, competition, where a cost realism analysis or a price realism analysis is going to focus on whether your cost is too low. And in that context, the government will use sources to figure out if your incumbent capture rate or the rates you're going to view are acceptable or not. The thing that's important to know in the distinction between a cost realism analysis and a price realism analysis is in the context of a cost realism analysis, the government has the ability to bump up your anticipated price. So even though your bid may be, 700 million, you guys thought it was a good bid, if there's a cost realism analysis being done, the government has the ability to take it up to 750 or whatever it is for what the expected cost is going to be. In the context of a price realism analysis, which isn't frequently used because it's in the context of a firm fixed price contract, the government can assess whether your price is reasonable or not. They cannot make an adjustment to your price, but they can use it as an assessment of risk to see if you fully understand the scope of the project. So again, Lindsay, I didn't mean to interrupt, but this came up, with regard to the price information. So I just thought it was important to sort of highlight those distinctions.
Thank you, Paul. So moving to the next key theme, it's something that we touched on again a little bit before, and it comes up in discussions as well as some issues that can be addressed in the proposal writing phase to avoid these common pitfalls, but it's that the agencies are not required to spoon feed offerors. So this case, JJ Global Services provided a good example. In this case, there was an error in formatting in the offeror's proposal that caused some of the information to fall outside of the page limits prescribed by the RFP. The GAO denied the protest and held that it's up to the agency whether or not to seek clarifications regarding proposals, and that an agency is not obligated to sort through an offeror's proposal to decide which pages should and should not be included. Another key theme that we see in the case law is that the agency cannot give you credit for information that's not contained in your proposal. So this first case involved a protester who failed to include a CPAR to support one of its past performance references. And the protester made a few arguments that the agency could have discovered the CPAR on its own. And the GAO rejected this argument and held that the agency is not required to seek out such information that the offeror didn't submit. And the protester also argued that the agency was aware of the existence of the CPAR and therefore it was improper to ignore it under the close at hand doctrine. But again, the GAO rejected that argument and held that the close at hand doctrine is not intended to remedy an offeror's failure to include this type of information in its proposal. So
And
the quote,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry, Paul.
No, go
Sure.
ahead, please.
Just the quote at the end sort of wrapped it up and summarized this important point that the agency had no obligation to seek out and favorably consider information that the protester was required to have submitted.
Yeah, I think this case underscores that Lindsay just discussed underscores an important point in that while the government doesn't have to go hunt for favorable information, you know, typically in the context of past performance, the government is permitted to do it. And so you can't find yourself in a situation that, you know, you can't say that the government was required to do it because it was permissive. And then you have to look at that if they did do it, did they do enough? And I mean, and those just aren't typically going to be, you know, winning protest grounds, at least based on my experience. So, I mean, again, this underscores the point that if you have favorable past performance, make sure you get in your proposal. And if you're going to use people as past performance references, it might make some sense to reach out to them and to tell them that you're using them as a reference. And you'd really, really appreciate it if they would return the government's call when the government does call. A lot of times you see this in the context of companies that are just, you know, they're growing as government contractors, and they might not have a number of federal contracts, but they do have contracts with municipalities or states, and they want to use those as references. But they don't always take the steps to let those entities know that they're going to be a reference, and that it would be very helpful to this company if they would actually provide the government with the information or fill out, you know, whatever required questionnaire. Sorry, Lindsay.
Thank you, Paul. So this case just provides another example of the same idea that the agency can't give credit for information that's not in the proposal. So here, the protester was undergoing an impending corporate restructuring that the agency was aware of, and the agency assessed a weakness because based on the information at the time of the evaluation, it was unclear whether this transaction would negatively impact performance. And the protester argued that the agency should have known that the change in ownership would only result in a name change and not negatively impact performance. However, the GAO denied the protest and held that because the protester didn't provide information about the transaction or the potential impact on performance, that it was reasonable for the agency to assume that the transaction could have potentially impacted performance absent additional information. Okay, so this is another key point, our final key point that Paul definitely hit home before, that if you do not follow instructions, your proposal may be disqualified. So in this particular example, the offeror did include the necessary information in the proposal. However, the solicitation required offerors to provide the information in a diagram rather than a narrative form. And the GAO held that the agency was reasonable to consider only the information contained in the diagram rather than that contained in the narrative. So with those key themes in the case law in mind, I'll pass it over to James, who's going to discuss effective debriefing strategies.
James, before you get started, I just wanted to announce our CLE code for this presentation. It's Bid Protest 2021 for those folks seeking CLE credit. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
All right. No, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Lindsay. So, all right, now we're going to turn to debriefing strategies. This is sort of the next logical sequence in this 4-part series on bid protest. I think it's important for any contractor to understand that there's really 2 main purposes in a debriefing. It's to learn. Initially, it's to learn from your mistakes or to improve your proposal, right? It's not always, I know the context of this discussion is bid protest, and that's what we're going to probably focus on, but without even thinking about a bid protest, you should always, use the debriefing process to your advantage. Many contractors, when they're successful, maybe in the excitement of getting the award, fail to ask for a debriefing. You should always ask for a debriefing. including when you win, to find that information, figure out how the agency evaluated your proposal, seek input, and see if you can make improvements. So that's one objective, but also it's no secret that debriefings are also intended to, or so they provide you an opportunity to evaluate whether you want to protest and or whether you have grounds to protest. And to use a phrase that I like to say a lot, to get in the door. You know, if you filed a protest before, you know that it's not always easy to come up with good grounds of protest. In many ways, most protests are speculative, or there's always some degree of speculation whenever you're making allegations about the awardee's proposal. And an effective, as we'll discuss probably next week, effective protest grounds would include those against the awardee's proposal. Of course, you don't know the awardee's proposal, you don't know anything about it, and it's not easy to raise challenges against that. But sometimes you want to look for issues that would get you in the door at the GAO, at the Court of Federal Claims, so you can then further explore whether you have other grounds. And that's something that I think I just wanted to talk about in this section about things to think about as you go into the debriefing. The first part to think about initially is just to know the requirements, procedurally. In FAR Part 15 procurements, you have to request a debriefing within 3 calendar days, not business days. So always do that when you get the award notice. You should immediately request a debriefing. If you're in a situation where there's a competitive range there's established and you are removed from the competitive range, you are given an opportunity to request a debriefing, a pre-award debriefing at that time, or delay until after award is made, and then you can get a post-award debriefing. You should always request an immediate pre-award debriefing. This is sort of a side issue there procedurally. If you don't request a pre-award debriefing and you wait till after award, which could be months later, when the government goes on to evaluate the remaining offerors in the competitive range, you will not be able to obtain the SECA stay. So that's something that's really important, a suspension of performance. Another side observation that's important to keep in mind, as many contractors know, and with the significant use of the GSA schedules program, you are not entitled to a debriefing under GSA schedule orders. It is just a brief explanation of award. That's the extent of the requirement in FAR Part 8. And most ordering agencies will stay true to that term and give you a very, very brief explanation. And that's all you get. A common mistake is when people will request a debriefing. Sometimes even the government uses the term debriefing in a FAR Part 8 procurement. That does not make it a debriefing. They might call it a debriefing. It's not a debriefing. It's just a brief explanation of award. And so where that can mislead you is if you rely on that. You request a debriefing under a GSA schedule order within 3 days. You think you're going to get one. Maybe the agency will give you one. Maybe they won't. But at that point, you may have compromised the timeliness of a protest. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, James, that brings up a good point that, one of the reasons that the notice of award and the debriefing dates and what type of communication you have with the government are so important is that it does start to trigger the clock at the GAO if you are going to file a protest. And, there are times when it's not clear whether you actually got a debriefing from the government or whether the debriefing's closed. And so maybe you go in early, but as, James and I discussed with our associates, we can redo premature, we can't undo late. And, the GAO's timeliness rules, I mean, they're very, very strict and unforgiving.
Yeah, and that's and maybe sort of a kind of include a side conversation about the timeliness. There's for those who have filed protests before, there's sort of two different issues that you're thinking about when evaluating when you should file a protest. There's the timeliness to get into the GAO, but there's also you can also file a timely protest but be late for purposes of triggering the suspension of work. And most protesters, you want to trigger the suspension of work. And so, you have 5 days, the later of 10 days after award or 5 days after a required debriefing to trigger the work, the new contract award. So if you don't know whether or not a debriefing was required, like in a GSA schedule order, or if you don't know when it was given, that will affect when you decide to protest. Something else to be aware of that's really changed over recent years. Many of you may remember that some years ago, the Department of Defense rolled out an enhanced debriefing mechanism. Initially, it was a pilot program, and I think the idea behind this enhanced debriefing was a recognition that the more information the government provides, the better for industry, not only to contribute to learning lessons, but also from a defensive protest strategy where the government, at least in theory, recognize that there is value to sharing more information and answering more questions with contractors before closing debriefings. In my personal experience and in my personal observation, I do think that the more information the government does give you, the less likely there will be a protest. I think a lot of contractors, when they don't have a strong understanding of why the government selected someone else or why they gave certain ratings, they're suspicious, and you're inclined to protest, to challenge, and to test the government's evaluation. When the government is guarded with information, it makes people suspicious. And of course, every procurement is different. There's a number of factors, whether you're the incumbent, whether the size of the procurement, its strategic value to you. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why you would or would not protest anyway. But just generally speaking, I think more information is better, and would likely discourage protest. I think that's why the government, why DoD rolled out the enhanced debriefings with that in mind. I don't know, if it necessarily means that you'll end up getting more information. I think you get some additional information, but I don't know if it's still as much as contractors would like. But just to touch on that quickly. Several years ago, the pilot program was converted into a class deviation, where it was sort of an official DoD policy, where you are given 2 days to ask additional questions. So a debriefing is given, you receive a written debriefing, and then you have 2 business days, not calendar days, but 2 business days to ask additional questions. And then the clock for protesting or getting the SECA stay, the stop work order, starts when the government responds to those additional questions. The Federal Circuit recently clarified in a decision at the end of last year an issue that I don't think was really that was really debated, but we now know that what the Federal Circuit says about it, that the clock starts only if you ask questions within that 2 business day period. So if your debriefing happens on day 1, and you then have 2 days to ask questions, and you choose not to ask questions, you have to go back to day 1, and that's when the clock started for filing a protest and triggering the SECA stay. You don't automatically get 2 days, the 2 days plus 5, the protester learned in that case. 2 weeks ago, I think it was on May 20th, the Department of Defense or the FAR Council issued a DFAR supplement rule, which actually codifies the enhanced debriefing process for DoD procurement. So just for those who are tracking that, it will now be in regulation. And I think the only other interesting item of note in the DFAR supplement rule is that in addition to the process of having 2 days to ask questions, it also provides and now would require the government to give a contractor a redacted source selection document as part of the enhanced debriefing for procurements in excess of $100 million, or if you're a small contractor, if the procurement is valued between 10 and 100 million. So that's something that's nice to see. I've seen DoD doing that anyway in a lot of cases, and that's something that they will provide sometimes when asked. But at least now for DoD procurements, that's something that for larger contract awards, or at least for small business contractors, if you're over 10 million, if the procurement's over 10 million, you should be receiving that, which is helpful. Assuming it's not too redacted, that can provide a lot of answers to the questions that you would have about why the government came out the way that they did. The last item I just wanted to mention before going on to the next slide here is just to know when the debriefing occurs and when it closes. You need to pay attention to what is in writing. I mean, the government does have the opportunity or the right to keep a debriefing open. They can give you initial debriefing slides and tell you that the debriefing will be held tomorrow and give you slides today. And just because you received the slides today does not mean that the debriefing started today. Or maybe it did start, but it didn't end until they hold a conference call with you, or maybe an in-person meeting. But you just have to be very careful. You need to make sure it's clear what constitutes the debriefing and when it ends. Apart from the enhanced debriefing process for DoD, I mean, civilian agencies can do this as well. They can always keep a debriefing open. They can engage in dialogue. They can give you an opportunity to ask questions, and you can do that and keep the debriefing open. I think our general rule of thumb is assume the debriefing has occurred and that it's closed unless the government makes clear in writing that it has not. It's too risky to make assumptions that the debriefing's still open unless the government says so. So hopefully, a written debriefing or maybe a slide deck that's provided to you before an in-person debriefing will tell you that the debriefing will be closed at the conclusion of the meeting. That gives you a basis to know that you don't have to rush to file a protest before the debriefing. So just something to keep in mind. And I think, and generally, honestly, I think I've seen the government seems to be pretty good about specifying that. I don't seem to see that as often anymore, where the government will be pretty clear. This officially closes the debriefing, so you know. Okay, so what is the government required to tell you in a debriefing? Unfortunately, not much. FAR 15506 outlines what is required, and it's mostly about your own proposal. So in just looking at that first item there, the government's evaluation of significant weaknesses and deficiencies, note that they don't even have to tell you about the strengths in your proposal or even regular weaknesses, just significant weaknesses or deficiencies. So that's not a lot of information. A lot of agencies will tell you more, and hopefully they will, but they don't have to, and sometimes they don't. Sort of skipping down, summary of the rationale for award. You can often obtain that in a redacted source selection document if they will give it to you. And then On number 6, the reasonable responses to relevant questions about source selection procedures. That's pretty subjective. It gives the government an opportunity, or it gives you an opportunity to request information. If sometimes, if possible, if you can try to tie a question into the RFP process, you might be able to convince the government that it's a question they should answer. But technically, even this item here, reasonable responses to relevant questions, is not open-ended. I mean, it's tied to questions about the source selection procedures contained in the RFP. So, and I realize I skipped over number 2 as well. They should provide the overall technical rating of the successful offer of the awardee, and your own past performance information. So you should receive the ratings. You're not required to receive details about the awardee's proposal, and if there is a ranking, you should receive that as well. So, unfortunately, going back to my comment a few minutes ago, a lot of agencies prefer to be minimalist, and they don't like to give a lot of information. And I think that's a disservice, not only in terms of the primary reason for debriefings, which is to help you learn lessons and improve your proposal, but it can also be frustrating if you are questioning whether to challenge the evaluation and award decision, and you're just not sure. You feel that something's wrong, and when the government doesn't give you that information, it can lead you to conclude that something was off, and that they may be hiding something.
Yeah, James, have you seen at all? Like, I've seen this trend over the last year that, while the agency is going to respond to reasonable questions, what they do now is they limit the number of questions you could submit. Like, I've had a couple instances where, I've worked with clients on trying to formulate questions for debriefing, and you look at what the government sends over, and it's like, we're only going to consider 10 questions.
Yeah. No, I've definitely seen that, and I think, assuming it's 10, I think if they limit it to only 5 questions, that is sometimes a little bit too restrictive. But certainly, and you make a good point. Certainly, if the government does not limit the number of questions you ask, including in the enhanced debriefing environment where you're entitled to ask questions, I don't know if it's the best strategy, and I know, sort of discussing nests, or talking about the types of things that you should be asking. I don't think it's always the best strategy to ask 50 questions. The more you ask, the less likely the government is to answer questions or provide meaningful responses. You're going to get canned answers. So if you want to use, if you want the debriefing process to be meaningful, you should be pretty selective in your questions. So I think generally 10 is probably a good number anyway. So if they do limit that, that's probably not the worst thing in the world. But and you can probably really kind of think strategically about what are the 10 questions you would really want to be answered. I've also seen, Paul, situations where, as part of an enhanced debriefing, that the government will then allow additional follow-up questions. So they give you several rounds, not just that one 2-day minimum. But and that's just something to keep in mind. The government can always decide when they're going to close the debriefing. So if they do ask you more questions, you can keep that process going until they tell you the debriefing's closed. But just to share some thoughts on the types of questions. Obviously, it's going to be the questions are going to be tailored to your own procurement, your own proposal, and you can't always just use canned questions for every debriefing. But a few observations from my perspective in terms of questions that I think tend to be effective. The goal is to obtain useful information, right? So yes or no questions are generally going to be better. They're easier for the government to answer, and therefore more likely to be answered. If you're asking the government to provide a narrative response, you're probably asking for too much work, and so I wouldn't do that. So think of questions that are more likely to get just sort of a simple answer. Did the agency make a cost realism adjustment? Yes or no? To your proposal, to the awardee's proposal. Recognizing the government is not supposed to share source selection sensitive information. There's a reluctance on the part of the government to share too much, and so whenever yes or no questions are easier for them to answer, and I think that you tend to find out more that way. I think the question should always try to explore your own weaknesses or the lack of strengths. If they do describe specific weaknesses that you did receive or deficiencies, you should ask questions about them. I mean, sort of test what they say. I think when there's no evidence in the debriefing that you received a strength for something that you think is a really strong feature of the proposal, you should ask that question. Did the government consider some blank, a certain feature of your proposal? Although I think the government usually is not going to give this information to you, they're certainly not required to, and they're arguably not supposed to give this to you, but I think you should always ask questions about the awardee's strengths and weaknesses. You should ask questions about the key factors in the trade-off. And sometimes the government does share that information. So, there's no harm in asking a question that's not answered. So just keep that in mind. Certainly want to explore the cost price evaluation, figure out whether there was, cost of it, sort of classic cost type environment, whether cost realism occurred, whether adjustments, if it's a price analysis, did they sort of follow the RFP's criteria? If price realism was part of the RFP, did they do that? Unbalanced pricing, certain issues where there may be something to pick up on. I think procedural questions can be really effective. So, for example, did the agency ask or seek clarifications from the awardee? Again, it's a yes or no question. It's also going to the process of the evaluation, and that may give you an opening to question whether some level of unfair discussions occurred. You'd say, okay, the agency did talk to the awardee. They never talked to us. Maybe there's something there. You can ask a question, did the agency consider past performance information, beyond the references that were provided in the proposal? Lindsay mentioned the too close at hand rule before, and whether the government needs to go outside of your proposal. They're not required to, but they can, unless it's too close at hand to ignore, right? But that's something that without asking the government to reveal anything about the awardee's past performance or how it was rated or what references they looked at, you're simply asking, did you consider information beyond what was in the awardee's proposal? Yes or no? That can give you an avenue to challenge the past performance evaluation.
But James, as part of that, I think you also want to ask, are there any, to the extent they don't tell you in the context of the debriefing, but are there any past performance or corporate experience references that were contained in your proposal that they didn't consider?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of times, like, you think a past performance reference or a corporate experience reference is just spot on, and then you find out the government, didn't consider it. You don't get the past performance evaluation you anticipated.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think, just sort of to wrap up these points here, asking about the competition, ranking, whether you were next in line for award. I'd caution that there's not really a bright line rule as to whether you should ask these questions or not. Going back to the context where, if you are considering filing a protest and you're now thinking about your debriefing as an opportunity to better evaluate potential protest grounds and whether you want to protest, sometimes it may be better not to ask a question. You may not want to know the answer because getting an answer may make it more difficult to file a protest. Where it can sometimes be better to sort of be ignorant of the competition, your relative standing, if the goal is to file a protest and get in the door, maybe develop other grounds of protest later, if you're able to do that. But that's a tough decision because it's so fact specific. It's so dependent on the company, the procurement, your objectives there. But so I do caution that sometimes you may not want to ask these questions, but I think generally it's good to know if the government will reveal it. It's nice to know if you're not next in line for award. You're not the company that the government was about to give this to. Maybe there are 3 or 4 people ahead of you, and usually or oftentimes that information will convince you not to protest. So just keep that in mind. All right. So moving on to the next slide here. Request an oral or in-person debriefing. I don't know, Paul, how many times you've seen this recently, but just from my own experience, it seems like the in-person debriefing, and certainly with COVID, no one was doing in-person debriefings the last year, but even well before COVID, it seems like the trend of doing in-person debriefings really, I have not seen a lot of those. And have you come across those recently?
I actually have one I did for a client, and there was actually a couple others. I think it is sort of agency specific. I think from my experience, I think DoD is a little bit more likely to at least do a in-person or telephonic. I think some of the non-DoD agencies are more likely to do it in writing. I think the reason is that, it's tough when you're getting peppered with questions about a procurement, and there's so many opportunities to say something wrong that's going to get incorporated into a protest, or you have the situation where you get a really good answer from the contracting officer on a question, and the legal guy, the legal person, comes in and tries to clean it up. So I think they just feel that it's safer. I don't know that it's as beneficial as they think, because I think there's some utility to actually being able to look somebody in the eye and read their body language when they're giving you an answer versus just looking at words on a page. But I agree with you. It seems to be the exception rather than the rule, where, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, it seemed almost like every debriefing was in person.
Yeah, that's my experience. It seems that it's safer to put everything in writing, and oftentimes the written debriefing is provided along with the award notice, so you don't even have a chance to request a debriefing. It's given immediately, so the clock starts ticking. That's a smart move by the agency sometimes if they want to keep things moving. I would say that even though agencies may be less inclined now than ever to grant an in-person debriefing if it doesn't require travel or it's not too burdensome, I do think it's always worth asking if it's an important procurement. Sometimes having that in person interaction as a contractor does give you the benefit to read the body language. And I think a lot of times in those environments, when you're in a conference room with the government, you can ask a lot of these questions in a conversational way. They're probably going to be very guarded and not give you much. So it may seem like it was a wasted effort, but you can tell when they stiffen up a little bit and maybe react when they're not able to answer the question. Did you say, hey, source selection authority, did you consider the fact that we offered these 5 things? I don't see any evidence of that in the strengths that you assigned. Did you guys consider this? And sometimes you'll sort of get a reaction where you can tell the government doesn't even know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
And they may have just completely missed a key part of your proposal, or they may have assigned a weakness for something, and you sort of say, well, did you read the other part of the proposal that already clarified that? And you can sort of catch them in that awkward moment where they're not going to admit. I mean, the government's not going to use a debriefing to admit error, but so you're not going to get them to acknowledge that, but you can press a little bit. And sometimes in that environment, I mean, that can actually embolden you to say, yeah, I think we've got a good reason to protest. I mean, the government just seemed unprepared for those issues.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, you bring up a good point too, that if the government does react badly at a debriefing and you have some concerns about the strength of the record, you can always file a protest and withdraw it. I mean, we've had any number of clients. I mean, you and I've had any number of clients where something didn't go well at the debriefing. They wanted to take a look under the hood to get a look at the record. You look at the record and there's nothing there, and then you just walk away. I mean, that's always an option. So just because you file a protest doesn't mean you have to see it through to the end. I mean, especially if you're not an incumbent. Hey, we got a question, James, on debriefings I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
The question was, does outside counsel's presence at a debriefing make the government more likely to bring their counsel and stick to canned answers?
Yeah, no, that's, I would say that definitely that, just the government does not want their personnel to be in a potentially adversarial environment without their own lawyers. And so I generally will tell clients that it's not worth having a lawyer present on their side. It tends to have a chilling effect, I think, on the willingness of the agency to answer questions and have candid discussions, because they're always looking over their shoulder to the agency lawyer to make sure that they're not going off script. That's not to say that the agency lawyer would not attend anyway. I mean, that person may attend, so you can't really control that. But I think it's generally going to be, you're more likely to get information if you kind of go in on your own. I would say though that you usually can bring a team, at least have several people. You should try to transcribe. If you're not allowed to record it, you ought to at least transcribe and take very detailed notes, because it's really useful to capture specific statements made. And in fact, in that context, I think it's worth mentioning something that I said a few minutes ago about filing protests and the speculative nature of protests. Every protest you file, you're always subject to a potential motion to dismiss, because your argument's not sufficiently supported by facts. That's a classic problem at the GAO, and a really good way to avoid that is to cite something that was stated in a debriefing, and sometimes debriefing information is incorrect. I mean, you get incorrect information in slides because they're sloppy. Sometimes they tell you the wrong price, and you think, oh man, they totally misevaluated a price. They included the wrong number. Well, that just means the debriefing was prepared poorly. It doesn't mean that it's actually what happened, but it does give you a way to get in the door in a protest. It gives you something to hang the protest on. And so if you can record what you hear in the debriefing or statements made, that can be a good way to counter a motion to dismiss, certain arguments that may be borderline speculative. So, and then I was gonna mention, to sort of watch out, and just sort of looking at the point of the slide, I just wanted to mention that watch out for the same day debriefing letter. I mentioned that keep an eye out for when the debriefing. Sometimes if you receive information in the award notice, it may in fact be the debriefing, and just don't lose sight of that, because the timeliness of a protest is at the GAO is contingent on this. It's such a strict timeliness rule, and you really don't want to overlook that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was I was just gonna say I agree with your assessment on outside counsel's presence. I think that where outside counsel can be the most effective is in helping shape the questions you're going to submit to the agency. I think that their role's more effective behind the scenes. I agree with you that I think it does have a chilling effect to have outside counsel, because it's almost, I think it's taken by the agency that you're definitely going to protest, so they're going to hold their cards a lot closer to the vest. I think it's probably less risky if your in-house counsel goes, but outside counsel seems to be, to me, a signal to the agency, whether it's valid or not, that you're looking to file a bid protest. So I just think that behind the scenes is just a better role.
Yeah, and let me add back to that, and I will say, and I agree. I mean, usually I discourage it. I have gone to debriefings, including in-person debriefings, before, when a client really wants that. Maybe there's no secret that there's going to be a protest, and they want the person who is going to be writing the protest to be asking the agency questions. And that I won't say that there's not a benefit from my perspective in doing that. Sure, it's useful, but I just don't think it's necessary. I mean, we don't need to have that in-person interaction with the agency to draft the protest grounds. We just need the information, sort of the data that comes out of it to write the protest. And most protests, the opening protest is really, it's to get in the door. It's a pleading, and the real grounds of protests are typically those that are developed once we get access to the record. And so I think from the lawyer perspective, it's not like we need to have that in-person exposure to what the government said about the evaluation in order to effectively protest, or sort of prosecute the protest. So, yeah.
I think one other point you made, I wanted to follow up on the idea of having a team going to the debriefing. I think that's a good idea. I think that as you're identifying your team, you should probably appoint one or two people as the primary questioners to the government, so that your company's speaking with one voice. I also think it's important that while everybody should take notes, there should be somebody there whose primary role is not to ask questions, but to just be the scribe. And it's not a glorious job, but I'll tell you what, as an outside counsel, the more fulsome set of notes you get from your client at a debriefing, the better protest document you're going to get, the more ground you're going to get. And as James mentioned, my experience has been that in the rarest of cases, the initial protest grounds aren't the best. It's the supplemental protest grounds. And so, your goal, if you're going to protest, is to give your outside counsel as much information as you can, so they can get the biggest record from the agency, because it's going to be through the mining of that record that you're probably going to get your best protest grounds.
Yeah, one final point on oral or in-person debriefings to keep in mind. That's not really an issue when you have written debriefings. Under the FAR, under the Competition and Contracting Act, which is the statute that entitles you to a stay of performance, a post-award stay, when you file the protest within the prescribed time frame. The time period is triggered based on when the debriefing is first offered, not when it's held, and that issue is usually not present when the government emails you a written debriefing, because the debriefing is given, held when you receive it over email, right? But when you ask for an oral or in-person debriefing, that's when you get into issues of schedule, and you request an in-person debriefing, and the government says, okay, how about tomorrow? And you say, no, how about next Wednesday? And the government says, sure, yeah, we'll meet next Wednesday. Well, that's great, and maybe they'll meet, but what you may have unknowingly done in that moment is sort of waived your right to get a suspension, because the 5-day rule, the 5-day clock for triggering the SICA stay started when the debriefing was offered tomorrow, on Friday. So the rule is, accept whatever time the government offers. Don't negotiate. Don't ask for a different time. If they offer it, you take it. And if not, you better make sure that that the alternative time is close enough so that you're not going to lose out. 5 days after a debriefing is not a lot of time to put together a protest. So just keep that in mind when you do request an in-person or telephonic debriefing. And just to wrap up the last slide here, I think the point of that was just as part of your debriefing, request redacted documents if possible. DOD has been doing that anyway, and I think the new DFARS rule that was proposed a couple weeks ago for enhanced debriefings requiring redacted source selection documents will make this more common anyway. But it never hurts to ask for documents in advance of a debriefing or as part of your questions. That can give you a lot of critical information. So with that, I think that concludes our discussion, Paul.
Yeah, thank you both, James and Lindsay. I appreciate everything. Hey, we're coming to the end of our time. I recognize that we did get some questions that we were not able to address. Lindsay, James, myself will take a look at the questions. We'll put our heads together and we'll respond separately to you via email. I hope you found today's presentation useful and informative, and I hope that you'll join us for our 3 remaining presentations, with the next one scheduled for June 10th from 2:30 to 4. It'll cover winning strategies and themes in the bid protest arena. Thanks so much, everyone that joined us today, and thanks again to Lindsay and James.